I had seen her many times before, but never quite the way I did that evening. My married neighbor, the woman who lived just across the hall, was usually a figure of quiet elegance. She was the kind of woman you noticed without realizing you were noticing. The way she carried herself, steady and composed, made her stand out in the simplest of settings. That night, I stepped out of my apartment to collect a parcel, and she was there in the corridor, watering the small line of potted plants she kept outside her door. The hallway light was soft, golden, and it made the strands of her hair glow faintly as they slipped from her bun. For a moment, I just stood there, pretending to fumble with the parcel slip in my hand, while really I was caught in the way she moved. Slow, deliberate, with a grace that didn't need anyone's attention, and yet, it held mine completely. When she looked up and saw me, she smiled. Not the polite half-smile neighbors often give each other, but one that lingered, gentle and warm, as if she were truly glad to see me. "Good evening," she said softly, and I swear, the simplicity of those words carried a calm that stayed with me long after. I returned her greeting, trying to sound casual, but something about her presence always unsettled me in ways I couldn't explain. She was older than me, married, and her life was supposed to be far from mine, yet there was a stillness about her that drew me closer without me taking a single step. As she bent down to adjust a small clay pot, I caught the faint scent of her perfume drifting through the hallway, light, floral, like the memory of spring carried on a breeze. It clung to the air even as she moved away, and I found myself inhaling deeper than I should, memorizing something I had no right to notice. She laughed briefly when her sleeve brushed against the wet leaves, leaving a dark patch of water on the fabric. "These plants keep me busier than I expected," she said with a little shrug, her voice carrying the soft lilt of amusement. I wanted to say something clever, something that would make her laugh again, but all I managed was, "They look well taken care of." She tilted her head, looking at me longer than needed, and for the briefest moment, it felt like she was searching for something in my face. Then she smiled again, that same warm smile that seemed to reach past the surface, and turned back to her plants. It was such a small exchange, no more than a few words, a smile, and the faint brush of her presence, but as I walked back into my apartment, I realized I was carrying something heavier than before. A quiet awareness of her. Of the way her eyes softened when they met mine, the scent she left in the air, and the strange, unexpected warmth of her voice echoing faintly in my head. That was the night I began to notice her, really notice her, in ways I never had before. In the days that followed, our paths seemed to cross more often. At first, I thought it was coincidence, catching her in the hallway, passing by as she stepped out for groceries, or holding the elevator door just as she approached. But soon, I realized she had a way of turning even the smallest encounters into moments that lingered. One morning, I had been carrying a heavy bag of supplies, fumbling awkwardly with the keys, when I heard her voice behind me. "Let me help you with that." Before I could protest, she had already taken the smaller bag from my hands. The movement was simple, yet I felt a strange tightening in my chest at the warmth of her gesture. She carried it with ease and placed it by my door, brushing her hands together lightly. "Thank you," I said, a little too earnestly. She only smiled, her eyes narrowing in that gentle way that made her face seem younger, almost playful. Over the next week, little exchanges like this began to form a quiet rhythm between us. Once, she knocked softly on my door to ask if I had sugar to spare. Another time, she handed me a book, saying it was one she had finished and thought I might enjoy. Each time, our conversation stretched just a little longer. It wasn't the words themselves that mattered, they were about ordinary things, recipes, her plants, a movie she had recently watched. But it was the way she listened. When I spoke, she tilted her head slightly, her eyes fixed on mine as though nothing else in the world could interrupt her attention. And in those silences between sentences, I often found myself searching for something to say just to keep her gaze from slipping away. I noticed the little things, too. The faint lines at the corners of her eyes when she laughed. The way her fingers brushed her hair back when it fell forward, tucking it neatly behind her ear. The small pause she took before answering, as though weighing her words carefully. Sometimes, when she handed me something, a cup of tea, a book, even a folded napkin, her fingers would graze mine. The contact was fleeting, almost accidental, but each time it sent a quiet warmth spreading through me, leaving me unsettled long after. There was nothing inappropriate in our conversations. Not a single word spoken out of place. Yet, beneath the surface, something subtle pulsed between us. A closeness that neither of us named but both of us felt. One evening, as I stood at her door returning the book she had lent me, she laughed at a story I shared. The sound of her laughter echoed in the quiet hallway, light and unguarded, and I realized then that I had never heard her laugh that freely when her husband was around. It was in these small, ordinary moments that something extraordinary began to take shape, not with grand declarations, but with smiles, glances, and the kind of silence that speaks louder than words. And though I told myself these were just harmless exchanges, I couldn't shake the thought that I was beginning to look forward to her more than I should. The night it rained, everything changed. The downpour began suddenly, beating against the windows in a steady rhythm that filled the otherwise quiet building. I had been sitting with a book, half distracted by the storm outside, when there was a soft knock at my door. It startled me. It was late, far past the hour when neighbors came visiting. When I opened the door, she was standing there, her umbrella dripping, her shawl damp at the edges. Strands of her hair clung to her face, darker from the rain. But it wasn't just the storm that unsettled me, it was the look in her eyes. Something fragile, something searching. "Sorry to disturb you," she said, her voice low, almost hesitant. "The power went out in my apartment. I just didn't want to sit alone in the dark." I stepped aside without a word, letting her in. She moved quietly, her presence filling the small space with an unexpected warmth despite the rain-soaked air she carried with her. I lit a candle, setting it between us on the table. The flickering light softened her features, and for the first time, she seemed less like the composed woman I always admired from a distance, and more like someone carrying weight she hadn't meant for anyone to see. We sat for a while, listening to the storm. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders, her fingers gripping the fabric as though holding herself together. I could tell she wanted to speak, and I waited, saying nothing, just letting the silence stretch until she was ready. Finally, her voice broke through, quieter than the rain. "Do you ever feel invisible?" she asked, her eyes fixed on the candle's flame. "Like you're living your life, doing everything you're supposed to, and yet no one really sees you anymore?" Her words carried a heaviness that pulled at me. I didn't rush to answer. I knew this wasn't a question meant for advice. It was a confession, one she had held inside too long. She went on, her voice trembling slightly. "I used to dream a lot, you know. Traveling, painting, trying things just for the joy of it. But somewhere along the way, life just became about keeping things together. And I don't even know when I stopped asking for more." Her eyes glistened in the candlelight, and she blinked quickly, as though embarrassed to let me see. Without thinking, I reached across the table, my hand resting gently over hers. Her fingers were cool, trembling faintly under my touch. For a moment, she didn't move, then she let out a breath, her shoulders loosening as though some part of her had finally unclenched. I didn't say much. I only whispered, "I see you." And somehow, those 3 words were enough. She didn't look away this time. Her gaze met mine, steady and searching, and in that silence, the storm outside seemed to fade into the background. It was in that moment I realized, beneath her confident grace lived a quiet ache. And for reasons I didn't yet understand, she had chosen me to share it with. After that rainy night, something between us shifted. It wasn't spoken, it wasn't even acknowledged, but it was there, a quiet thread that tugged at both of us whenever we found ourselves near each other. Our conversations didn't change in content. We still talked about small things, the weather, her plants, books, the little annoyances of daily life. But the way we looked at each other during those conversations, that was different. One afternoon, she invited me over to help her sort through an old box of photographs. The excuse was innocent enough, yet the moment I stepped inside her living room, I felt that familiar unease, not discomfort, but the heightened awareness that comes when every sense sharpens. We sat on the rug, the box of photographs spilled out between us. She picked up one, laughing softly as she told me the story behind it. Her laughter filled the room with warmth, but I found myself distracted, not by the photo, but by the nearness of her. Her knee brushed mine when she leaned closer to show me a picture, and though the touch was barely there, it sent a pulse of awareness through me. I tried to focus on the photographs, but every detail of her became sharper, the way her hair slipped forward as she bent down, the faint scent of her perfume that clung to the air, the way her hand occasionally brushed against mine as we both reached for the same picture. Each time our skin touched, neither of us pulled away. There were silences too, long ones, where neither of us spoke, but neither moved apart either. Instead, we sat there, pretending to study the photographs while secretly caught in the gravity of each other's presence. At one point, she paused, holding a picture in her hands, her expression softening. I asked what she was thinking, and she turned her gaze to me instead of answering. The look lingered longer than it should have, long enough for me to feel my chest tighten, long enough for me to forget to breathe for a moment. When she finally looked away, she cleared her throat gently, as if shaking off a thought she shouldn't have allowed herself. Yet even then, I could see the faint curve of a smile tugging at her lips. Later that evening, we decided to take a walk in the park nearby. The air was cool, the sky brushed with fading light. As we strolled side by side, our hands occasionally swung close enough to almost touch. Once, her fingers brushed against mine, soft, accidental, but she didn't move away. Neither did I. That faint contact remained in my mind the entire walk, more vivid than any words we exchanged. By the time we returned to the building, nothing had been said outright, but everything had changed. We both knew it. Our closeness was no longer just neighborly. It was something else, something fragile, delicate, but undeniable. And as I closed the door to my apartment that night, the memory of her touch on my hand replayed over and over, leaving me restless with a longing I couldn't name. It was late when she called me over. Her voice on the phone was soft, almost hesitant, asking if I had a moment to stop by. I didn't question it, I just went. Her apartment was quiet when she opened the door, lit only by a lamp in the corner. She had tied her hair back loosely, a few strands falling free, framing her face. She looked tired, but there was something else in her eyes, something unsettled. "Sorry, I didn't mean to bother you," she said as I stepped inside. I didn't feel like being alone tonight." We sat on the couch, a little closer than we normally did. She poured tea for both of us, though I noticed her hands trembled faintly as she set the cups down. For a while, we just talked about ordinary things. But there was an edge beneath every word, a silence pressing in between sentences, as though both of us were holding back what we really wanted to say. At one point, she fell quiet, staring into her cup. Then she whispered, "You ever wish you could just start over? Rewrite parts of your life, make choices that weren't so safe?" Her voice cracked slightly, and before I could respond, she turned to look at me. And in that moment, her eyes said more than her words ever could. They held a longing, a sadness, and something unspoken that pulled me in deeper than I'd ever dared go. I swallowed hard, my heart racing. Sometimes, I admitted, my voice low. Sometimes I wished that more than anything. Her gaze didn't move away. The silence stretched between us, heavy and charged. I could feel the warmth of her knee against mine, the closeness of her presence. Her lips parted slightly, as if she were about to speak, as if she had been holding back something she couldn't anymore. But then, she hesitated. She drew in a shaky breath and let out a quiet laugh, covering her mouth with her hand. "Listen to me," she said softly, shaking her head. "I'm being foolish." I wanted to tell her she wasn't. I wanted to reach for her hand, to tell her I knew exactly what she meant, that I felt it too. The words sat heavy in my chest, burning at the back of my throat. But they wouldn't come out. I was afraid. Afraid of crossing a line, afraid of saying something that could never be unsaid. So instead, I just sat there, silent. Watching her. Feeling the weight of everything neither of us dared to confess. When she finally leaned back, letting out a sigh, she smiled at me, a small, tired smile, but one that lingered. "Thank you for listening," she said softly. "It means more than you know." And though nothing had been spoken aloud, I knew the truth. We were both standing on the edge of something dangerous, something tender, something neither of us could name. That night, when I walked back into my own apartment, my chest still carried the echo of her almost confession. And though no words had been spoken, I had heard them all the same. The air between us had grown heavier with each passing day, like a quiet storm waiting at the edges of everything we said and did. I could feel it in the silences, in the way our conversations trailed off, leaving only the sound of our breathing filling the space between us. One evening, she asked me to help fix a shelf in her living room. The task was simple enough, but the closeness it demanded was not. As I crouched to tighten a screw, she knelt beside me, handing me the tools one by one. Our arms brushed, our shoulders touched, and each time, neither of us pulled back. When the shelf was finally secure, I turned to find her watching me, not with the casual friendliness of a neighbor, but with something far more fragile. Her eyes softened, her lips parted as if to say something, but no words came. We ended up sitting on the couch afterward, a comfortable silence settling around us. She leaned back, her head tilted slightly, and let out a breath that sounded more like release than fatigue. "You've been a kindness I didn't expect," she said softly, her voice trembling at the edges. I didn't know how to respond. My heart was already beating too fast, my thoughts tangled. So I only looked at her, letting my silence speak the things I was too afraid to say. And then, it happened. She reached out slowly, her hand hovering for a moment before brushing against my cheek. The touch was feather-light, her fingertips grazing my skin as if testing whether she had the right. My breath caught in my chest, every nerve in me alive beneath that gentle contact. For a moment, she kept her hand there, her thumb tracing just the edge of my jaw. Her touch was warm, steady, but I could feel the hesitation trembling beneath it, the pull between desire and restraint. I closed my eyes, leaning into her hand just slightly, silently telling her that I didn't want her to stop. When I opened them again, her gaze was still fixed on me, filled with a mixture of fear and tenderness I had never seen before. She gave a small, almost broken smile, as if apologizing without words. And then she withdrew her hand, folding it back into her lap. But even after she pulled away, I could still feel her touch lingering on my skin, like an imprint pressed too deeply to fade. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing to say. What had passed between us wasn't a confession, wasn't a promise, but it was enough. Enough to change everything. As I walked back to my apartment later that night, my cheek still burned faintly with the memory of her hand. It wasn't just touch, it was acknowledgement. A quiet, undeniable crossing of the line we had both been dancing around for so long. And though the world outside remained unchanged, I knew we could never return to where we were before. After that night, nothing needed to be spoken aloud. Something had already been acknowledged in the quiet brush of her hand against my cheek, something we couldn't deny anymore. But instead of pulling us apart, it seemed to bring a strange kind of calm. We didn't suddenly spend every moment together, nor did we speak in grand declarations. Life outside our connection moved forward in its usual, unremarkable rhythm. Yet between us, even the simplest exchanges carried a new depth. A glance across the hallway. A pause at her door. A smile that lingered a little longer than necessary. One evening, a week or so later, she asked me to join her for a walk. The air was warm, the sun dipping low on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. We walked slowly, side by side, saying little. There was no rush to fill the silence anymore, it had become its own language between us. Eventually, we found a quiet bench tucked beneath an old tree at the edge of the park. She sat first, smoothing her shawl across her lap, and I settled beside her. For a long moment, we simply watched the world around us, children playing in the distance, the golden light catching on the leaves, the soft hum of evening settling in. Then, in a voice barely louder than a whisper, she said, "I never expected this." I turned toward her, but she kept her gaze fixed on the horizon. "Expected what?" I asked gently. Her lips curved in a faint smile, though her eyes glistened. "That someone, younger, someone who doesn't owe me anything, would see me more clearly than anyone else has in years. Her words caught me off guard, yet they felt like the truest thing she had ever spoken. I swallowed hard, unsure how to answer, but my hand found hers almost instinctively. I laid my palm over hers, feeling the warmth of her skin beneath my touch. She didn't pull away. Instead, her fingers curled softly into mine, her grip steady, reassuring. We sat like that for a while, our hands joined, the silence wrapping around us like a shelter. I didn't think about her age, or the circumstances, or the lines we had blurred. All I knew was the peace I felt in that moment, the quiet certainty that we had found something rare, something we couldn't name but didn't need to. As the last light of day slipped away, she finally leaned toward me, resting her head gently against my shoulder. Her hair brushed my neck, soft and fragrant, and I felt the steadiness of her breath rise and fall. No words passed between us. They weren't needed. What we shared wasn't about confessions or promises, it was about being seen, about being understood, about finding comfort where neither of us had expected it. When I walked her back to the building that night, our fingers still laced together, I realized that love doesn't always arrive with thunder or fireworks. Sometimes it comes quietly, in stolen moments, in glances that last too long, in the warmth of a hand you never want to let go of. And though our story was complicated, it was ours, tender, fragile, and unforgettable.